Welcome. I'm Dr. Owen Anderson. I'm a professor of philosophy, and today we're going to look at the pre-Socratic philosophers. I'm going to share my screen so you can follow along on the notes. I'm relying on a new history of philosophy by Wallace Madsen for some of the details about the pre-Socratics. And he begins, I think correctly so, with the mythical context in the Babylonians and the Greeks, and I might add in there the Egyptians. And in that context, the gods emerge from an original substance, and then they create humans to be their servants. And sometimes there's a conflict between the gods, between one who wants to enlighten the humans, like Prometheus or Marduk, and then the gods who want to keep them in ignorance. For humans, death is original. There's always been death. It's kind of part of our of the reality of being material, due to being material. And so these often also involve stories about what happens to your soul. I'm thinking about the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Where it goes afterwards or where it was before this, being maybe put into the body and reincarnating. And so these mythical accounts are an attempt to explain the world, to make sense of the world around us by humans. They're appealing to finite gods like Marduk, Osiris, Zeus, and this is intellectually inadequate. The gods are not eternal. They had a beginning. They might be everlasting. They might continue on, but they had a beginning, and their origin needs to be explained. And also, the gods are made in the likeness of humans. They're arbitrary. They have human failings like lust. Zeus can't seem to control himself. And so taking these to be actually gods was intellectually inadequate, as if there's someone living on top of Mount Olympus. You can go up there and look around. But what about if there's psychological interpretations or symbolic interpretations? Um, might initially seem adequate, but they aren't a substitute for rational explanation. So the idea that Zeus stands for power and is a symbol of that, or the war between the gods are symbols about conflicts within humans. We have a good side and a bad side in conflict with us, but that still doesn't explain the origin of them or why we should believe those things are true. And so, given our need for meaning and our rational nature, a new explanation was sought by the philosophically minded. And that's really what brings us into the pre-Socratics. And they're called pre-Socratics because they come before Socrates. And just briefly, I'll mention there's usually two readings of Socrates. There's Socrates himself, who is focused on moral concerns, like what is good, what is just. And then there's Plato, and we get most of our information. We don't have anything written by Socrates. We get our information about Socrates from the Platonic dialogues. And so then Plato starts to write a kind of fictional Socrates where he's more concerned with metaphysics. And some of that kind of harkens back to the Babylonians and the Greeks, or they are Greeks, to the Egyptians. Especially you read some of the Babylonian stories about reincarnation, or the Greek stories about the journey, the Egyptian stories about the journey of the soul in Plato's view of Socrates. But what Plato does, and his student Aristotle, that takes philosophy in a whole new direction from these pre-Socratics, is they recognize that reality can't be reduced to just matter. And so that's why these pre-Socratics are kind of bracketed off as early materialists. And then Plato and Aristotle say, well, that's not adequate either. And the challenge, the search for a rational explanation continues. So right now we'll just focus in on these pre-Socratics, and we call them sometimes the first philosophers. We get that from Aristotle. In terms of trying to give an explanation of the world that doesn't appeal to myths, these could be the first. But in terms of dealing with these basic questions, and especially loving wisdom, these aren't the first. What do these do? Well, the first, Thales of Miletus, is, let's put his dates here, 624 to 546 BC. He began by rejecting the personal explanations of myths. Why this battle happened? Well, because Zeus was mad at Hera. He rejected that explanation and sought impersonal explanations in the place of superstition So he said that all is one and all is made of an underlying substance. And that substance is water. Now, it's interesting that the myths, say, of the Egyptians began with water, and out of that the gods emerged. And so Thales is kind of tapping into that and saying, yeah, there was just originally water, and out of that, all other things occur. All other things come to exist. So this begins the project, the material monist project. This is an influential view in the Western world, a view which is implicitly or explicitly assumed in much of science today, that there are only material explanations. Everything must be explained materially, and it's kind of a fear. If you don't do that, you'll end up back with the myths. And don't want to go with the myths, so you have to be a materialist. So the problem that comes up is how to show that the many aspects of the world, of human experience, can be explained in terms of one reality, in this case, water. This is called the problem of the one and the many. There's one thing, but how do we explain all the other things? How do we explain unity and diversity, permanence and change, appearance and reality? Is water really going to be what explains all those things? It didn't seem to be. And so because of that, Thales wasn't the last philosopher. He's only the first one in this line. After Thales, or roughly the same time, but Thales is said to be the first to give this kind of a theory, is Anaximander, 610 to 545. So he proposed that everything is made of an indeterminate stuff, the apeiron, which is boundless, having no particular quality. He probably reasoned this way. How can water, which is wet, account for dryness, the opposite of water? Dryness is not just the lack of something. You might have dirt, so it's not non-being. It's not just the lack of water, it's a thing, but it's dry, and water's never dry. So this is an example of the use of reason. To show that an explanation is inadequate. Wetness, A, cannot account for dryness, non-A. And so you say the only logical solution, assuming the original premise of material monism, all is matter, all is one, is to have an original substance without any qualities. Still, this was a material substance, not spirit. So he tries to explain everything in material terms. And the problem with this will be, can you have a material substance that has no properties, is boundless? It has minimally, it has extension, size of some kind, because it's material. And that then turns into a number of other possible examples of properties. So the boundless wasn't sufficient. Now you have Anaximenes, 585 to 528. So he doesn't accept the boundless, the apeiron. Instead, he argues that the original substance was air. If the apeiron was truly without any quality, then it could not be distinguished from non-being. And being cannot arise from non-being. So you see here again, the apeiron was truly, if it was truly without any quality, then it could not be distinguished from non-being. And so this is the same idea as above, the use of reason, because you have no qualities, none whatsoever. Remember, I said if it's material, it at least has extension, but none whatsoever. Well, that's non-being. How you can't get being from non-being? It's not really an explanation. So he posits air as the original. He says, perhaps air was a natural alternative since it was the closest thing to being indefinite. Yet with distinguishable still from non-being. So it's very indefinite, but it isn't non-being. But air has the same problem as water. Air cannot explain non-air. Just like wetness cannot explain dryness. So how do you explain wetness or earth or fire with air? You can't. So you see the process here. You see how the explanation is given, and then reason is used to critique it to show it's an inadequate explanation. So next we have Xenophanes. So he fled Persia and was a critic. He fled to the Persian conquest. I'll say Persian conquest of Ionia to Italy and Sicily. He was a critic of popular religion, the gods made in the image of man, and proposed pantheism instead. All is God. So this divine being is a unity containing all the diversity. One God. All right, you're seeing a theme here, though. Monism. These pre-Socratics are all monists so far. They're materialists and they're monists. So in place of the earlier philosophers who were Milesians and their hylozoism, which means matter has a life force in it to move itself and do things, in contrast to hylozoism, he believed that the divine being was the source of change. Although itself not undergoing change. But since God, for Xenophanes, is not transcendent, over and above nature, is part of nature, the change in nature would also be a change in God. So because he kept that original monism, all is one, changes in nature are also changes in God. But God is supposed to be, in his explanation, the unchanging thing that accounts for change. And so you have another contradiction in the explanation. It's not satisfactory. So next we get Pythagoras. 570 to 500. And it's interesting to see Persian, which would have had Babylonian influence here on Xenophanes. So even though he's fleeing the conquest of the Persians, he may have been influenced by them and this idea of the divine in all things. Now, Pythagoras introduced the belief in reincarnation to these Greeks. Already had been popular in Egypt, for example, and Babylon. And he sought release for the soul through contemplation of the eternal. What was permanent was the essence of things, and that essence is numerical. Things are numbers, and numbers are things. So before I get to the critique, the soul will be released from suffering and change by contemplating what is eternal and unchanging. And what's eternal and unchanging? Numbers and math. And so you might have learned the Pythagorean theorem, one of the important theorems in geometry, because Pythagoras is working in math. That's what we need to contemplate. So this whole idea that suffering and death are natural to matter, and we need to escape that material life by getting to what is eternal, was a theme that was back in the Greek and the Babylonians and the Egyptians as well. And so Pythagoras is continuing that. And in one way, he's therefore critiquing the materialism of the earlier pre-Socratics. And really, matter isn't enough to explain the world. And so he goes to numbers, and our soul will escape the body by contemplating these eternal things, these eternal numbers. Yet how essences come from or come to form things that come to be and pass away is not explained. He couldn't explain change. All is one, all is changeless. Well, then why is there change at all? Why does the body exist? How did it come to exist? Out of something that's perfectly unchanging. And on his view, his monism, there's no explanation. There's just the one. and no explanation of how did we get to change in the world. How did the idea of the numbers, which are eternal, give rise to things that are not eternal? And so it's an interesting problem you have. Again, just like water and dryness, you have unchanging things. How do we get from that to the change in the world? And there's no rational explanation given. Now we have Heraclitus of Ephesus, 544 through 484. So he eliminated the problem of how the one permanent being can change to become the many by denying the existence of any permanent reality at all. Everything is in a state of change. There is no permanent stuff underlying the world. So see how these two are opposites. Pythagoras and the eternal, the numbers. Heraclitus, there's nothing eternal. Nothing is permanent. All is change because all is matter. And so what he said is everything is fire, constantly in flux. Fire and water both have this sense of being alive compared to earth. Fire seems to consume things to stay alive, and then it changes and goes through changes. And it, in contrast to water, it produces heat, and that heat is transferred to other things. And so you say, yeah, fire is the underlying element. And that's also an older mystical tradition that you'll find in some Babylonian sources, that fire is the original substance that creates all other things. And so he says there is a law that governs the process of change. And only this law is permanent. This is the Greek word for logos. The logos governs all things. Called the logos is the universal reason that pervades everything. Everything comes to pass according to this reason. But here's a problem. If change is according to reason, then A cannot come from non-A, nor can being come from non-being. The problem of being that is permanent remains. You can't have only change. There must be something that is permanent. And so you have the same problem as the other philosophers. Heraclitus, although making an advancement and thinking about what is this eternal law, this reason, if he's going to be consistent and he's going to hold to reason consistently, has to say it can't all be changed. There must be something that's eternal. He didn't help us know what it is, though. Now, Parmenides, 545. So now Parmenides and Heraclitus are sometimes viewed as a kind of two sides. And there's arguments about who came first because they seem to be playing off each other's ideas. Heraclitus says all is change. Parmenides says he's from Alia in southern Italy. He developed the opposing idea that all is permanence. All is real and change is only apparent. Change does not really exist. Only what can be thought of by reason is real. The senses do not give knowledge. This permanent reality is one, indivisible, unmoving, and immutable. Non-being, cannot be thought, and cannot exist, right? By definition, non-being is non-existence, so it can't exist. You can't say non-existence exists, right? So there is no empty space. Space is something still. Maybe it's a fine ether, but the idea is you can't have non-being. It can't exist. Now, his disciple, Zeno, tried to show through several paradoxes that motion as change in space and time is inexplicable and therefore unreal. You might have heard of Zeno's paradoxes, Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles and the tortoise are racing, and Achilles gives the tortoise a head start. Now, as they start to go, of course, the tortoise is slower, Achilles is faster, but by the time Achilles catches up to the tortoise has moved a little bit. And by the time Achilles catches up to that, he's moved a little bit more. And by the time he's caught up to that, he's moved a little bit more. And so Achilles can never catch up to the tortoise, which just seems counterintuitive because if you actually have a race, Achilles beats the tortoise. Or if you want to go from here to the door, you'd have to cross the halfway point. And you'd have to cross the halfway point between that. And you'd have to cross the halfway point between that and the halfway point between that forever. So you never actually get to the door, but you can get to the door. So he's using these paradoxes to say change is unreal. It's incoherent. All is one. So to resolve the antinomies between Heraclitus and Parmenides, between senses and reason, between permanence and change, a new solution was sought in pluralism against the monism. So up until now, we've been working on what is that one thing that underlies everything else. And the solutions have failed to explain the world. Therefore, they failed to provide meaning, just like the earlier myths. The philosophers might say, oh, those earlier myths don't explain anything. Well, neither does your explanation. It fails by the very reason you claim to be using. So Empedocles, 495 through 435, in Sicily, said that there were four ultimate substances: earth, air, fire, and water. These were moved by two forces, love and hate. All of reality is to be explained in terms of the mixture of these four elements. In addition, the soul exists as distinct from the material elements. Surviving the body at death. But there are more. Problem is that there are more than four qualities in the world. Can qualitative change be explained in terms of four elements without one quality becoming another quality and thus violating the principle or the law of identity? Furthermore, love and hate and soul are not derivable from the four elements. These are personal and immaterial in nature, which is precisely what the earlier myths were using. But Empedocles is tapping into the Egyptian myths, the Babylonian myths, to say there is a soul, it dies, and you have to think about what happens to it after death. And generally speaking, the view from the Egyptians was there's a measure of your good deeds and bad deeds. And if your good deeds are better, you go on to a good afterlife, a good reincarnation. If they're worse, you go on to punishment. So that's a theme that's deeply held here. But Empedocles is not able to explain the simple things that we experience any more than the myths were. And so the need for meaning says, well, we can't stop with that explanation. It's not sufficient. It's not adequate. So Anaxagoras, 499 to 425, brought Milesian philosophy to Athens. So he solved the problem of change by denying the one and affirming an infinite number of qualitatively different substances. All change results from admixture of various proportions of these different qualities. The source of change is by the activity of nous, or mind, or reason. Which is an immaterial and intelligent force that acts purposefully in the world. But if the many are ultimate, then there is no underlying unity, nothing common among them all. So, for example, if they're material, then they have one thing in common: they're extended in space. But he's denying they have anything in common. There's just the infinite individual things, and their combination is what makes what we see around us today. And since all perceived qualities are admixtures and not a simple ultimate, what is real is unknowable, and what appears is not real. Also, so let me explain that one. Ultimate is not spelled right, and unknowable. All the perceived qualities we see are admixtures, but there's nothing uniting all the things that you see. What you see is not those things. Those things are not knowable then. But what appears to you, what you see, isn't the real things, these infinite differences. And so you can't know them, but what appears to you is not real. This is not providing meaning. And since individual beings were admixtures, not real forms, nous was merely a source of motion, not purpose. The world remained unintelligible. The individual beings that exist, there's an infinite number of them, are not striving to resemble forms of things like triangle, like you arrange all the little dots into a triangle form. There's no such forms. And so the mind is not purposely acting to some goal like that. The mind is just the source of change, but the mind is not one of the many things either. And so he hasn't given an account of this mind. And so the world, in his explanation, remains unintelligible. You may as well go back to the original myths. And then finally, Democritus, Democritus, 460 to 370 of Abdura in northern Greece, continued the Ionian philosophy, which had articulated the atomic view as an outcome of earlier speculation about the many small things that make up everything. So Democritus develops the idea that everything is made up of atoms. There are countless eternal, indivisible, unchanging units of being that are qualitatively identical. These qualities are seen in the senses, or seen by the senses. The qualities that are seen by the senses are not in these atoms, but relative to the perceiver. So the atoms aren't, say, for example, red, but they get organized in a way that you perceive them as red. Someone else might perceive them differently. Those qualities are in the perceiver. The atoms are not perceivable, but can be known only by reason. Atoms move in space, which is real. All reality is to be explained in terms of atoms and their movements and combinations. So you can start to hear in this the current view of things. Just going back to Democritus. So I'm going to qualify that at the end of the lecture, though. But you can see that, right? The periodic table of atoms combines to give us the things that we perceive. Here's the problems. But if senses give appearances only, differences cannot be justified by reason either. For how can adding two identical units give any more than two of the same kind? How can you get to difference if they're all the same? And it does start that way. They're all protons or neutrons or electrons, and you add them up together and you get differences, but they're all the same things. I'll talk about that in a moment here. How does the modern materialist try to answer this? So quality is distinct from quantity. The quality of being red or blue is not the same as numbers, like 4 atoms equals redness. Well, that doesn't follow. So the basic issue remain unresolved on the basis of material monism. This gave rise to relativism and skepticism of the sophists. Attention shifted from nature to man. And Socrates took up the challenge of the sophists, say it's Socrates step 1 or stage 1 when it is Socrates. And he's responding to the sophists who say we can't really know anything. These philosophers tried and they failed. Therefore, we should just focus on getting what you want by learning good oratory skills. You become a politician and a lawyer and you speak well and you get the people to do what you want. And so Socrates challenged that idea and said, well, wait a minute. Do we want them to do what is good or not good? Well, what is good? So we'd have to know what is good then. And so that begins the next phase of philosophy with Socrates. Now, notice here some applications to today. The attempt to find the underlying substance, sometimes called the quintessence, the fifth element, air, fire, water, earth, all different. They can't explain the things we experienced in total, but there must be some fifth thing that also failed. And so the application is this: these failures to give a meaningful explanation require that we back up and reject the assumption involved. Material monism. And that is what the next phase does. That's what Plato and Aristotle do. They introduced dualism. There's both mind and matter. And they have their own tensions that we'll look at in another history. But that's what happens in the history of philosophy, is they say, well, this original presupposition can't be true then. However, we seem to have returned to it today. The atomic theory is common among materialists, just assumed to be the case. But it has the same failings noted just above. It can't really explain all things we experience, especially not personal qualities. Atoms can't explain thought, mind. And so the modern materialists will get into the subatomic particles, because it turns out they'll say, okay, the things we called atoms weren't actually the atoms. They are divisible, and they're subatomic particles. And you can go even smaller than that into the quantum realm. And they'll say in the quantum realm, things are indeterminate and unknowable. Interestingly, relying on explanations that start in matter but end up in this skepticism. We just can't know. The ultimate things that make up everything we see around us are unknowable and indeterminate. And we have to go beyond thought. So sometimes this gets picked up and popularized in a kind of new agey sense of science has proven that we can't know anything, and we have to silence our mind and go into some higher dimension of consciousness, because this dimension is unknowable and indeterminate. But you can see how that followed the pattern that we just saw above. The pattern of atomic theory was not sufficient. Material monism is not sufficient. So instead of rejecting that theory and instead going to an alternative view, they keep the theory, atomic theory in this variation, and say, and really it's indeterminate, we just can't know. So they end up in skepticism, just like the pre-Socratics. And so what do you see today? Well, among humanists and scientists is very similar to the day of the sophists. The shift is back to getting what you want in society, trying to change people's minds, arguing that you've not got what you deserve and other people should give you what you deserve. So the sophism of convincing people through rhetoric is once again what's popular because of this underlying skepticism. We can't make sense of the world. But the loss of meaning through intelligibility is not a final point. As rational beings, we need meaning. Merely sophism will not satisfy, and we are left with a meaninglessness. And so sophism is not a final stage. It's a in-between stage of emptiness, meaninglessness, despair. That's a word that people used to say. Anxiety. Call this an age of anxiety, age of despair. And people will come along and say, no, we need an explanation of the world. And the current atomic theory isn't it. will have to do more than that. And the current quantum theory isn't that, which says life is indeterminate and unintelligible. These patterns have been repeated before in the history of thought, and that's one of the reasons. Two things we're doing here. Well, let me say three. The search for meaning and the use of reason. Once you've abandoned reason, you'll lose meaning. We saw that pattern through these thinkers. Second, contradiction, a method, I should say. Contradictions require us to back up and examine our presuppositions. So in this case, it was material monism. And then third, the materialist explanation of the world violates reason as the laws of thought and cannot explain human experience really any better than the myths did. And so is not adequate and will not satisfy us as rational beings. We'll need to look for more. So that's three things that come out of this history, but the history itself is a history of how these early Greek philosophers attempted to find meaning, moving away from personal explanations of the gods to materialist explanations of matter and change. Thanks for joining me.